The miracle of the seventh-day ox. The story of Nikolai Panchak, a Russian Seventh-day Adventist pastor, imprisoned in a Siberian prison camp for his faith. In our last reading, Nikolai, through the offices of a kindly Russian official, has been released from the box on the condition that on his new job of hauling water from the spring back to the camp, that he could get his Sabbaths off if he could bring enough water in 6 days to meet the 7-day needs of the camp. Nikolai was grateful to God for the kind officer and for the opportunity he had to show his faith. But Maxim, the ox, seemed to have different ideas, and no matter what Nikolai did, he was not able to get the ox to move fast enough to get in the extra loads of water that would be required for him to have his Sabbaths off. We continue our story in chapter 23 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. The next morning, Nikolai was up before everyone. He was up before any of the prisoners had stirred, and before the warden or the guards. He was up before even the cook had begun to stoke the fires in the kitchen. But the sun was already peeking over the horizon, and Nikolai guessed it must be about 4 a.m. He was a little weary from the short night, and his legs were a bit stiff, but he flexed them again and again to limber them up. He couldn't afford to sleep in or slack off now. He needed to be up and going, out on that road to the spring, so he could get enough water barrels hauled in by Friday. The sun wasn't up yet. It hadn't even begun to rise in the east as Nikolai threw on his clothes, grabbed a flask of water, and went to the stables to rouse old Maxim. Of course, the hour was earlier than Maxim was accustomed to, but Nikolai managed to get him on his feet and into his harness. The old ox eyed Nikolai wearily, as if he were suspicious of the man's every move. And why shouldn't he be? This man was crazy, urging him to hurry all day long, pushing him to work all hours of the night. And now he was getting the ox up and out of the stable at an unearthly hour. Nikolai was in a hurry to get going. He didn't think he had time to eat a regular breakfast, but he did stop by the kitchen for a carry-out meal. The cook was up by now and gave him some bread and carrots to take with him. Nikolai knew he could stop by the kitchen later that morning for some hot borscht and Russian bread, but for now, the cold food would have to do. The man and ox headed west out of the camp and toward the spring. Maxim knew the way even in the dark. He could walk the distance himself without anyone guiding him. He would have even been able to make the trip with Nikolai sleeping in the back of the ox cart. Unfortunately, there wasn't room in the cart. The barrels were too big and took up all the space. The morning was peaceful at this hour, and with the silence of nature all around them, the only sound that broke the stillness of the morning was the creaking of old Maxim's harness and the squeaking wheels on the ox cart. Other than that, there was little to punctuate the early morning hour. In the pale light of pre-dawn, Nikolai could see a few lemmings coming out of the burrows they had made for themselves in the matted sedge grass lining the roadway. A little farther along, he saw a snowy owl perched on a craggy rock, poking its way through the Siberian landscape. And of course, there were the snowshoe hares, now brown with their summer camouflage. At one point, Nikolai rounded a bend in the road and suddenly caught his breath. Sitting in the middle of the road was a large wolf, his lanky body tall and lean. Nikolai guessed he was about 3 or 4 feet tall at the shoulder, and he just sat there, staring at the man and the ox. Maxim pulled to a stop for a few tense moments. It was obvious the ox didn't really know what to do. Nikolai sensed he was frightened because he could see the muscles ripple and tighten in the ox's neck and shoulders. Did Nikolai need to worry? Was this wolf out scouting for a meal? Would he come back with others from his wolf pack? The wolf finally got up and trotted off to the north. Nikolai breathed a little easier after the wolf left. No one had alerted him to the possibility of wolf attacks out here, and he and Oleg hadn't encountered the wolf the previous day. He consoled himself with the idea that the wolf was probably not a threat to them anyway. There were plenty of lemons and snowshoe hares for the wolf to hunt and eat. Of course, when the harsh winter struck Siberia come October, Nikolai was not sure where he and the ox would rank on the food chain for a hungry pack of wolves. Food was not exactly abundant in this deserted country. The only other sizable game on the steppes of Siberia would be the reindeer that traveled in scattered herds. Or so he had been told when he asked Petya the cook during a conversation with him in the kitchen one evening. The end of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. It had been one of those days months back when Nikolai had just gotten out of the box and was trying to recuperate. He had managed to hobble to the kitchen late in the day to get something to eat. After the evening meal, he had stayed late and helped Petya scrub the pots and pans and prepare some sourdough for baking the next morning. They worked in silence until Petya began talking about cooking and the limited supply of ingredients he had in the camp. He was hoping for some reindeer meat that winter. The reindeer herds come this way some years, other years we never see them, Petya had said as he covered the sourdough with a towel and set it aside. When they do come, and we can shoot a few, we lay aside enough meat for a good long while. 15 or 20 reindeer is a lot of meat, but of course it doesn't go far with 300 men in the camp. Petya glanced at Nikolai and raised his eyebrows. I suppose you're wondering where the guns are that they used to hunt the reindeer. Well, I hadn't thought of that, but now that you mention it, I haven't seen any guns in the camp. That's because they don't bring the guns out unless the reindeer herds come this way. I think they must keep the rifles locked up in the warden's office or something. No one really knows. I've never been told. He continued, of course, they give the rifles only to the guards, but no one really gives it much thought. Everyone is just glad to get some meat to eat. Reindeer meat is pretty good eating. Petya began to hang the pots and pans up to dry, and Nikolai did what he could to help. If the reindeer don't come this way, then we have to satisfy ourselves with the cabbage, turnips, beets, and onions we grow in our gardens. They keep pretty well, and in the cold weather, we can store them on the ground in beds of hay. Nikolai thought about the vegetables that Petya cooked up in the borscht, cabbage and beets mostly. Borscht was something every Russian ate every day. Not to have borscht for a main meal was considered almost unthinkable. Petya had big forearms from his work in the kitchen, making bread, cutting up turnips and beets, and scrubbing pots and pans could do that to you. He was a quiet man and didn't appear to have many friends, but he was a great cook. Everybody said so. You're a good cook, Petya, Nikolai found himself saying, especially with the limited resources you have to work with. You just say that because you don't know any better, Petya insisted, laughing good-naturedly, and Nikolai found himself laughing too. You've been locked up in the box too long. You're always hungry, and anything that hits your tongue tastes good to you, Petya added. Nikolai's reminiscing ended when he reached the spring. As he filled the water barrels, the sun finally rose in all its glory. He worked quickly to finish the job and then turned Maxim and the ox cart around. It felt like they were making progress, and Maxim was responding well to the urgency Nikolai felt. At this pace, Nikolai was sure they'd be able to bring home 6 loads of water, 12 barrels, and who knew, maybe they would be able to do even more than that. In Nikolai's mind, 7 trips to the spring was not out of the question. All that morning, Nikolai drove the ox hard, never letting up with the stick, never allowing the ox to rest or pause by the road for a little sedge grass. Today was Wednesday. If he could manage to get 14 barrels of water into the camp by bedtime, and another 14 on Thursday, he would have to get only 10 on Friday. That would give him time to get home and prepare properly for the Sabbath when it was time for the sun to set. But Nikolai was getting way ahead of himself, and he had misjudged the nature of a beast of burden. As morning turned to afternoon and the sun turned west, old Maxim began to slow his pace. His shoulders sagged a little more, and his tongue began to hang out when they stopped at the spring or at the camp to unload the full barrels. Of course, Nikolai let the ox have a good long drink while he was filling the barrels at the spring. That was efficiency at its best. Why not give Maxim a chance to rest and drink his fill while Nikolai was busy filling the water barrels? But when they were back in the camp, Nikolai paused only long enough for Petya to hand him some bread and a tin bowlful of red borscht. At these times, Nikolai never gave Maxim a chance to get more than a short drink. And so they plodded on, with Maxim growing more tired each hour and slower with each leg of each trip. By late afternoon, it was obvious that pushing Maxim hard had sapped the ox's stamina and his willingness to keep going. In fact, the 5th trip to the spring took more than 3 hours. The sun was so low in the sky now that Nikolai could see they were going to be hard pressed to get 6 loads of water. They would have to work long after dark again to do it. He was so frustrated with Maxim as the time slipped away. But what could he do? He determined that he would simply have to drive the ox harder. He had no other choice. They would have to go faster to get the water in by Sabbath. Nikolai had come too far in his plan to let it go now. With a stronger resolve, Nikolai vowed to make Maxim work if it was the last thing he did on earth. But Nikolai knew that if this was really going to happen, something was going to have to change. He was going to have to reshape the way Maxim did things. To modify an animal's behavior, you had to force him to obey, either by punishing him for wrong behavior or by rewarding him for his obedience. He cringed as he suddenly realized that this was exactly what the warden had been trying to do with him. The warden had been stubbornly putting him in the wooden crate, trying to break him. "Is that what I'm doing to you?" Nikolai asked incredulously as he stared at Maxim. "Is that what this is all about?" The lemmings along the roadside stopped their squeaking and sat up to hear more of the debate. The snowshoe hares browsing on the short sedge grass perked up their ears to hear the final verdict. For a long moment, Nikolai gave the idea some thought, but then just as suddenly he snapped out of his reverie. "There's no time for that now," he argued, his mind seesawing back in the other direction. "I don't have time to be feeling sorry for an ox that doesn't want to work hard. If I can do it, then he can do it too." Nikolai didn't let up. I'll push you all day, Maxim, and all night if I need to. I'll go without meals. I'll go without sleep." In frustration, he whacked Maxim on the rump with the goad, and the old ox jumped forward. Maxim was going to work hard all day, every day. Nikolai would see to that. Of course, at the end of the week, Maxim was going to get the Sabbath off, just as Nikolai was. The pastor smiled in spite of his irritation. Any rest for Nikolai would be a rest for Maxim. The old ox didn't know it yet, but he would soon enough. Come Sabbath, he'd be lying in the stable, enjoying the sedge grass piled high in his feeding trough. The end of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. On Thursday morning, Nikolai was up even earlier than the day before, but his worst fears from the day before had been realized. Try as he might, he had managed to haul only 6 loads of water. As he thought about how hard he had worked until long after dark, the whole thing was disheartening. What else did he need to do that he had not already done? Short of giving up, there seemed no answers. When Nikolai went to the stables, Maxim seemed listless and tired, as though he had already used up the day's ration of energy. As they headed out of the camp, the old ox walked with his head down and no light in his eyes. He didn't even look Nikolai's way when the man tried to give him his favorite snack, a carrot. Nikolai knew he was now paying the price for pushing Maxim to the limit 2 days in a row. And in some sad sort of a way, it seemed only right. He had ignored the common sense logic and the goodness in his heart that said he should be kinder to the animal. Justice in nature's law of averages had prevailed, and Nikolai couldn't deny that it should be so. Hour after hour, the ox plodded slowly along with no sense of the urgency that Nikolai felt. He had worked overtime 2 days in a row, and now it seemed that he was thinking he deserved to slow things down a bit. After all, it wasn't his neck on the line. Why should he work faster, simply to trade one day for another? Of course, he had no knowledge of Nikolai's Sabbath, or the importance of the standoff between the preacher and the warden. The sun passed its zenith as morning turned to afternoon. White cumulus clouds scudded across the landscape, now green with the short grasses of summer growth. A few white cardamom flowers stared up at the man and the ox as they passed by with the creaking water cart. Suddenly, the lone wolf came out to watch them again. This time, he sat on a slight rise to the south, following their every move, as though the man and beast were the best source of entertainment he had seen in days. But Nikolai hardly noticed them. He was growing more and more discouraged by the hour. All his efforts to work hard and deliver the quota of barrels by sunset Friday were going to be of no avail. It just wasn't going to be enough. Nikolai could feel it in his bones. There wasn't enough time. Nikolai filled the barrels for the 3rd time that day, and then turned the cart around again. As he trudged along the road, Nikolai did the math one more time. 10 barrels of water per day were needed, 50 by Friday night, so that he wouldn't have to haul any on Sabbath. 2 barrels of water per trip meant that he needed to make 25 trips in just 4 days. With the 6 loads he hauled on Tuesday and the 6 on Wednesday, he would need a total of 13 more. That meant he would need at least 7 for today and then maybe 6 for Friday. How was he going to be able to do it? He hadn't managed to bring in 7 loads either of the other 2 days. And today, Maxim was working even slower. 7 loads seemed impossible. To be sure, at this rate, they'd never make it by sundown Friday. If he had begun working on Sunday, maybe he would have been able to make 1 extra trip per day. By then he could have gotten the number of barrels needed by Friday night. By now, old Maxim was even limping a bit, and his pace had slowed to a little more than a crawl. Nikolai finally stopped the old ox and examined his foot. The foot had picked up a rock, so Nikolai removed it. He stood up and sighed before slapping Maxim on the hindquarters. There was no longer any point in using the ox goad to urge Maxim along. He simply let the ox go at his own pace. Evening finally came, putting both Nikolai and Maxim out of their misery. They had managed only 5 loads from the spring, 10 barrels of water. That was a good day's work, but not nearly enough to move them closer to Nikolai's goal. Nikolai's confidence was waning. He had thought a Sabbath day's rest would be a sure thing. Didn't God want him to have his Sabbath off? So what had gone wrong? Why hadn't things worked out between him and old Maxim? Why hadn't God helped him get the number of loads he needed to fill his quota by Friday night? Did God have other plans? Did God want him to spend another 10 days in the box? Had that been his original plan for Nikolai all along? Nikolai's brow knit in a furrowed frown. It didn't matter. He knew he wouldn't work on Sabbath, even with the ultimatum of the warden hanging over his head. There just seemed no way out, no way to turn. The end of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the miracle of the 7th-day ox. By now, Nikolai had no idea what God had in store. He was at a total loss as to what he should expect or what he should do next. 16 barrels of water. There was no way he could haul that many by sunset the next day. 10 for Friday, and then the extra 6 to make up the 10 he would need for the Sabbath supply. There just wasn't time. Nikolai had been doing his part all week, but it didn't seem to him that God was doing his. He had not answered Nikolai's prayers, at least not yet, and certainly not in the way Nikolai thought things should go. And from all appearances, it looked as though the window of opportunity was closing fast. The whole thing left Nikolai totally discouraged. Would he get to have his Sabbaths off? His faith wanted to say yes, but his logic said no. He had worked late Wednesday and then well after dark again on Thursday, but with only 4 extra barrels of water to show for it. Nikolai spent a long time on his knees in earnest prayer that night, even losing precious sleep to talk to his heavenly Father. He had to find a way to solve his dilemma. He had to succeed somehow. Eventually, he dropped off into a troubled sleep. Somewhere in the night, he awoke, still on his knees in prayer. As Nikolai climbed onto his bunk, a sudden thought struck him full in the face. Could it be that all his efforts to bring the water to the camp had been done on his own terms? Was it possible that he had been so anxious to earn a Sabbath day's rest that he had begun to rely on his own efforts to get it? a Bible story came to mind, and Nikolai wondered if his situation might be proving to be somewhat similar. God had called Gideon to lead the Israelite tribes against a common enemy, the Amalekites. The Israelites had rallied to arms, answering Gideon's call by the thousands. In fact, 32,000 of them had come, anxious for battle and ready to serve. Or were they? Evidently, God saw things differently than Gideon did. Two different tests were given. First, Gideon was told to send soldiers home if they were the least bit afraid. And second, all but 300 men were asked to leave because they weren't really ready for battle. Gideon was dismayed that God expected so much with so little to work with. And that's exactly how Nikolai was feeling right now. How was he going to keep the Sabbath day holy if he didn't even have time or the ox on his side? Nikolai half smiled a crooked grin in the darkness. Right now, he would be glad if he could have 300 oxen on his side. He turned over and tried to go to sleep. Like Gideon, Nikolai was beginning to realize that even if it were possible to bring in enough loads by Friday sunset, the triumph and credit were not to be his. He had wanted to do things his way. Not that his motive and intentions hadn't been pure. It was just that the plans had all been his. He knew that God wanted him to have the Sabbath off. There was no question about that. From the day Nikolai had arrived at the prison camp, he had been honoring the Sabbath, and he had suffered for it. But Nikolai thanked God every day that he had never given in and given up his loyalty to God's holy day. But the testing time was evidently not over. This time around, he wasn't being tested by being cooped up in a prison box. It was a different sort of test, one that required incredible amounts of energy and determination and patience. But in the end, he knew the victory would be God's. God was no doubt working things out for even a greater purpose than Nikolai could imagine. It had to be that. What else could it be? If Nikolai was being tested like Gideon, then it must be that his own plans would have to give way to God's plans. The way Nikolai had been doing things left little chance for the men in the camp to give God credit for anything resembling a miracle. But Nikolai was now beginning to see that if God had things his way, they wouldn't have a choice. It felt good to surrender everything to God once again. Nikolai had always believed in giving God full control. It was like second nature to him, and he lamented the fact that he allowed himself to get off track. Somewhere just before Nikolai dropped off to sleep, his mind drifted once again to one of his favorite Bible verses. All things work together for good to those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. The end of chapter 6 of the miracle of the seventh day ox.